Hello, Internet. This is Dean, and I would like to explain a few ideas that I have kicking around in my head. I have no academic accolades to justify my presentation of my thinking. This is not in any way an official output like you would hear from a real academic philosopher or person who has great knowledge of the history of philosophy or that kind of thing. Instead, it's just a regular idiot talking about the way he sees the world. And as far as my expectations are concerned, I don't have very many. I don't know that there's going to be more than a few people that will ever hear these words other than myself. Nonetheless, let's not get too boring before we get started. That all being said, you should take everything that I say with a grain of salt, and onward we go. So firstly, in order to get out what it is that I intend to communicate to you, I'd have to start with an idea. Any argument is really a series of propositions which the other person can either accept or reject. So let's start with one of those. And that is a rather odd idea that I sometimes get quite a bit of pushback on when I've tried to talk about it in the past with others. The idea that institutions, in a sense, are like artificial intelligences, that they think on their own and use human beings in their decision-making process as nodes, and that to some extent the unconscious of those minds, as well as the coherency of the process of thought and decision-making of an institution like a corporation in particular, along with evolutionary forces, not biological evolutionary forces, but still it stems from that, and it's the life or death of that organization and its identity, drives it in such a way as to make decisions that are along certain lines such that you really only are going to be able to understand why it's doing what it's doing or what it's likely to do if you just take into consideration that the people that comprise it are transitory agencies. They're there and then they're gone and they're replaced by someone else, but still some nature of character of the institution remains, but it's comparable to something like an animal or a plant growing in a terrarium. The truth is that it's doing what it needs to do in order to make more of itself. And its way of making more of itself might be different than biology, and not like an animal population exactly, but still, nonetheless, it's those forces that are driving it. And that in general, one of the things that you find if you look at cultural anthropology is that a lot of evolution of culture is driven by practical forces that are not well understood by the people that are thusly mentally and socially evolving. That a lot of what goes on around us in terms of change are things that are driven by collectively unconscious forces that are dark and mysterious to us, although once they're revealed, have a tendency to make things a lot more clear. And that trying to assign those changes to singular individuals or even sometimes groups is sometimes kind of a folly in a way of trying to predict or understand that behavior. What you're not seeing is that it's not like Hitler or Mussolini that created fascism and Nazism. It was a set of social conditions and economic conditions that really created those things. And without those conditions being present, maybe something else would have happened. And I would argue that something similar goes on with religions, corporations, and to a lesser extent, governments. That the process of decision making is different in a fundamental sense from that of human beings as individuals. And it's not just that there are other values and considerations that are involved in the decision. There are parameters that are there set in terms of, for example, motive. So a human being has the capacity to question their own motive and to understand it, to qualify it, to package it into words, and to push back against it if necessary. In understanding it and rating those motives against other values and other motives, we come to decision making, which results in ethics and morality, I would argue. That whatever you think about the naturalness, objectivity, or subjectivity of what we call morality, what it's really derived from is a mental capacity that human beings have in a way that makes us distinct, and that we have more of it than other animals. We have the capacity of reason such that we can take a look at why we're doing what we're doing and ask that question and change our motives by pushing back against certain urges, delayed gratification, as a psychologist would put it. Where other animals lack that capacity, not just because they lack some internal mental resolve, but I would argue, and this is not within the realm of science, but I would argue that it's because they can't conceptualize their motive. They lack that conceptualization, and in only understanding their motives in a very simple way, they tend not to ask why they're doing what they're doing, and only ask how they're doing what they're doing, how they're going to go about it better. And to that end, they can be exceedingly clever, I think surprisingly so sometimes, but they are limited in their way of seeing the world as well as the range of decisions that they have available to them, so long as they cannot form the accurate and complex self-understanding and reflection of self that leads to the same capacity that leads us to invent the word morality, right? And it's that questioning of motive, asking why. And not just of oneself, but of other people in the world and the world itself as a character. And it's from this that we derive every power that we have as human beings that makes us so much more than other animals. Right? But it's a capacity that is almost entirely lacking within our institutions. And that's something to grasp that's extremely vital. That religions and corporations in particular exist in an evolutionary paradigm in which they're either diminishing or increasing, dying out or making more of themselves, and that they're pushed by this, but with a singular motive that is never really discussed because it's just an assumption that's brought to the table and is well understood and is immovable. It's immutable. Survive and thrive or die, and no other motive can take its place, and no other value can be higher than that. And as a result, we cannot expect such institutions to have morality. They will always be amoral as long as that's the case. As long as a corporation has as its central, immutable, immovable, and unspoken goal that they should profit more, you can always expect that all of their decision-making should and will fall along those lines. I know that sounds obvious to some people, but it's funny how we lack continuity in our awareness of this and levy unreasonable expectations upon these institutions, because I would also argue that we need these institutions. We need the shoemaking factories to make shoes for us. We need the services and the goods that are provided by these institutions. And if we didn't have them from corporations, we'd have to try to create or invent something else. And this then kind of reprioritizes what they're there for and why they're there. right? They should be there for us as the general public. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be owned by the government, in my view. But at the same time, they need to have hard restraints put on them. And the allegory that I use is that of an oxen that has to have a ring put in its nose and be led in front of a plow by a farmer and maybe have its horns chopped off. Because if you don't, then the farm is going to become a meadow and someone's going to come along and find that farmer dead. And it'll be fine for the ox, maybe, but it's not so good for everyone else and everything else that's dependent upon the output of the farm, which to some extent, so is the ox. The natural instincts and intuitions of this entity that we've created may lead it to its own self-destruction. And it will never know better. And it will never be able to say no to itself when it's motivated to do so. Neither will the people that exist within it. And the perfect example of this is the banking and crash fiasco that happened and culminated in the early thousands and in 2008. The fact is that it was really a surprise to absolutely no one that the banks were collapsing and that the housing market was collapsing. Don't let them lie to you and say to you that no one expected it. I was in a position where I was, because of my work, I was reading what was at the time the Pink Pages, which is a newspaper. It had another name, the Economic Times or Gazette or something like that. That was coming to my workstation every day, and I would glance through it. And leading up for at least a year before the big collapse, there were apocalyptic statements in that economic journal about how there was going to be a collapse. They knew. They all knew. The bankers that made that collapse happen absolutely knew every single step of the way that what they were doing was walking straight over a cliff and leading all the rest of us over that same cliff. But the truth is, I think if they were being honest about it, they felt like they didn't really have a choice. Because the decisions that they were making in regards to their job, whatever position, however high up it may have been, was always going to be different than the decisions that they made in their personal lives, with their family, with their friends. They're not really acting in that same situation of personhood when they're acting as a node or a unit of decision making within that corporation, no matter how high up they are. The simple truth is they have to justify every decision according to a single criteria, and it's very short-sighted. And if that criteria and that value leads them over a cliff, then so be it. And just as long as they can escape the entity that they've now helped to both make grow and then die out, as long as they can sail away on a golden parachute, they surely will. The entity itself is still driven by instincts, the way that we were before we had the advent of freedom of will and the greater degree of self-reflection and sentience that we now enjoy whenever it is that happened. The truth is that the corporations that we've made that now dominate our government and our world have an animal mentality, and it's not because of any lack of intelligence. It's because of a lack of flexibility and short-sightedness in their decision-making, which is inevitable to their state and cannot be fixed by a set of laws or a good talking to. It doesn't make them evil, it makes them amoral. And only when you set up the system itself, including the laws, regulations, taxation, everything else, to account for that as just a basic truth you can't get away from, only then will we be able to make proper use of these institutions, if there's any proper use at all, and be able to have them do the things that they're supposed to do without wrecking the world, without destroying democracies, without sending us all to the poorhouse, without a lot of things I could go on about, gentrification in Seattle, the resulting riots, that kind of thing. So it seems like a no-brainer maybe to some people when they hear me say all this. Other people will be very unnerved by this idea. The idea that when you're looking at a commercial on the TV, that what you're looking at is a kind of AI. It's a kind of robot that pretends to be a human being through some actor or actress that they've hired in order to sell you something. And the actor or the actress doesn't mean what they're saying. And the script that they're speaking from was carefully crafted by a committee of people that may not even be the same company that is making that it's advertising for, and then presented it to a committee of people who talked about it and corrected it and wanted things added in or taken out, and then they went back and they redid it again, and then they made the final presentation of the commercial, and the CEO was there and signed off on it. And then that's who's speaking to you, is this machine that's speaking to you when you listen to a commercial. And it begins to take on different connotations. And I think a lot of people now are in a better position to appreciate that because of the internet, because of YouTube. Okay, because we have these other sources of media now where we can kind of get away from the TV in a way that we didn't for decades after World War II. And now you can kind of dry yourself out, if you want, from the commercialism and everything that it produces. Not just the commercials themselves, but the way that drives script writing in the TV shows and everything else. And be able to go back to it and look at that woman on the TV that's trying to sell us a perfume or a shoe or something, and understand that she's just some working girl who's trying to get her rent paid. She doesn't mean anything that she's saying. And that, in a way, it's like an alien insect wearing a human mask that's a real human being and trying to talk to us as real human beings and convince us that it is a human being when it's not. When it is not. And that its motives are simple and, in a sense, parasitic or predatory. And that it would just as soon see us be destroyed or tortured as soon as it would be to enjoy its product if for some reason it benefited it more than selling us the product. I mean, if we let it go that way, maybe that's exactly the way that it would be. And not to underestimate the potential for cruelty in a system dominated by that kind of simplicity. It is by rote, in its essence, amoral, and does not see human beings as being valuable except in the way in which value can be extracted from them. And all the rest of our philosophies and our morality comes to be dominated by this thing, that the value of a human being can be measured in dollars and cents. And that it can be no one else's fault if somehow 80% of our work sector is in the service sector, and the service sector's top 3 employers pay less than $20,000 a year to their employees on average, and that's not enough to afford life. This is somehow the fault of the employees instead of the fault of the system that these machines, these insects, created for us. If you're looking for a weird alien explanation for the reason why the world is shaped the way it is and how this complex jungle of civilization has turned out the way it's turned out, this is where you really need to look. You're a cell inside of another organism, but you're smarter as that cell and more sentient. Maybe not smarter, more sentient, more self-aware than the thing that you comprise only a small, tiny part of. And isn't your worth really dependent upon that sentience? If you have human rights, isn't that what that relies on? Instead of, as a consideration, instead of the amount of money that you have in your bank account, wouldn't the world work better if that were the consideration? I would argue that it can and should and has in the past, and that the changes that we've seen over my lifetime have bent things more and more in a direction of dominance by private institutions over our government and over our lives and over our entire mindset. People are looking for some kind of revolution as a way out of it, but they don't understand it in the first place. But they're in the best position ever to be able to do so. And this is kind of the first step in doing it. Recognize what sentience is as much as you're able. Science hasn't really comprehended it, but we know it has something to do with the accuracy, complexity, and nuance, the fidelity of our mental image of ourselves, of our self-reflectiveness, our ability to look in the mirror, figuratively speaking, and understand what we're looking at. And that potentially has the capacity to create value, and that, in fact, it has the potential, stands the potential for us to be able to do something like create in the first place, where that term becomes meaningful. What else do other things create? Ants create ants' nests, but it's not really because of anything other than nature and evolution. It does it. They didn't decide to make the ant nest. They must. Where with us, we have choices where we can make things. And that stems from that capacity at self-reflection, right? We just need to understand now that the mound that we've built, the institutions in an abstract sense that dominate it, lack that capacity. And it's not a matter of getting them to have it. And that's important. Avoid the temptation of thinking that if you just talk to them the right way, that they're somehow magically going to have a conscience. The truth is that having a conscience, or at least the capacity to decide between right and wrong, and to understand that there's a right and wrong, other than what people just happen to think because of social conditioning. The idea itself, right or wrong, only comes up in the face of that kind of sentience that we possess and that they lack. So for a corporation, the only morality that really exists is the way in which it can be used as a sales pitch or a legal defense, and is really nothing more and cannot be more. It doesn't mean that the people that are in charge of the corporation don't have morals. It doesn't mean that they don't have sentience. They may be selected through an evolutionary process because they are more capable of boxing in, compartmentalizing. They may be better at compartmentalizing in order to avoid moral problems when making decisions for the corporation when they're acting in that capacity. But whether they are or whether they're not, they really can't use the same value comparison that they do in their normal walk-a-day lives, if they have one. That they can't use that same decision-making process when they're there in the boardroom. They can't. And they'll tell you all the good reasons why they can't. And maybe we should take them at their word. It doesn't really mean that they're bad people. They're just parts in a machine, and when they're gone, they'll be replaced by another more suitable part. And that other suitable part, it's suitable because it's capable of making those cold-hearted decisions. You really can't change that with a law. You can't change that with a lecture. You can't change that with understanding. You can only anticipate it and compensate for it in the way in which you design your government and the business sector itself, how it works, how the government and the public sector relates to the private sector. It's one of the reasons why, no, a government cannot and should not be like a business. It really shouldn't be looked at that way. And why becoming more like a business is not what we want out of government in a democracy. And if we want a healthy, functioning world, we can't really have it like that. The truth is the government thrives and survives through a very different aim, and it must have a healthy business sector underneath it, but it must be truly underneath it. And we should have more to say about what that government does than those businesses do. And that includes their representatives and their primary beneficiaries. The truth is that the broader bulk of humanity should have more to say about how our world works than these institutions that we created. Not because they're evil and not because we can live without them, because we can't. But at the same time, you can't let them be in charge. You can't let the beast not have a ring in its nose, not have its horns cut off, and have any choice about whether or not it gets to be in front of the plow. You have to take care of it. You have to feed it. You have to water it. You have to make sure that it's healthy, and that's all true. But at the same time, never confuse the farmer and the beneficiaries of the farm with the animal, the beast of burden that we've created for that purpose.